My name is Hannah Miller. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been someone people describe as easy to live with. Calm, reasonable. The kind of woman who doesn't raise her voice in a room full of louder ones. I used to think that was a compliment. If you'd asked the people around me who I was, they might have said I was supportive, forgiving, stable. Someone who didn't make problems bigger than they needed to be. What they probably wouldn't have said is that I was watching everything, or that silence, for me, was never emptiness. It was processing. This story isn't dramatic in the way people expect stories about marriage to be. There's no single explosion, no one moment where everything shatters on the floor. It's quieter than that, slower, more uncomfortable, because it unfolds the way real life usually does, through patterns, not scenes. Our marriage survived because I kept forgiving, and for a long time that felt true. Forgiveness became the glue, the explanation, the reason I stayed. Every small hurt had a soft landing because I was so good at finding reasons to understand it. But understanding isn't the same as being safe. And forgiveness isn't the same as being respected. What I want to be clear about from the beginning is this. I'm not telling this story to punish anyone. I'm not here to paint myself as a hero or someone else as a villain. I don't believe in emotional revenge. I believe in clarity. And sometimes clarity only comes after you stop cushioning the truth. This story is about what happens when forgiveness is used as a delay, not a solution. About how quiet people are often mistaken for passive ones. About how endurance can look like loyalty right up until the moment it becomes self-erasure. There were years when I genuinely believed that patience would fix what honesty couldn't. That if I stayed soft enough, the sharp edges around me would eventually dull. What I didn't realize then, but understand now, is captured in a sentence I wish I'd learned earlier. Forgiveness delayed the ending. It didn't prevent it. What follows is not a warning, and it's not advice. It's a record of what I noticed, of what I allowed. And at the moment, I stopped confusing kindness with obligation. If you've ever been told you're strong because you tolerate more than you should, if you've ever wondered whether staying quiet is the same as staying peaceful, then, before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever forgiven someone so many times that you forgot to ask what it was costing you? To the people around us, I was the steady one. That was the word they used most often. Steady. The kind of person you didn't worry about, because I never appeared to wobble. In our marriage, that translated into being the emotional ballast. If something went wrong, I adjusted. If plans changed, I adapted. If moods shifted, I smoothed the air without announcing I'd done it. I don't say that with bitterness. At the time, I wore that role with a quiet pride. I believed being dependable was a form of love. My husband would sometimes joke that I was low maintenance, and everyone laughed like it was a compliment you couldn't improve on. Friends would say things like, "You're so understanding," or "You're so patient." I could never. What they meant was that I didn't ask much, and what I heard was that I shouldn't start. In group settings, I was often the listener, the one who remembered details about other people's lives, the one who noticed when someone's tone changed mid-sentence. I filled in gaps without being asked. If there was emotional labor to be done quietly, it found its way to me, and because I didn't protest, people assumed it was natural, effortless. In our marriage, this perception solidified quickly. I became the emotional translator, the peacekeeper, the one who could handle it. If he was stressed, I understood. If he was distant, I gave space. If something he said stung, I told myself he didn't mean it that way. Context became my favorite shield. Looking back, I can see how early that dynamic formed. Not because he demanded it outright, but because I offered it without being asked. I filled the silences. I softened the edges. I preemptively forgave things before they had a chance to be examined. There's a certain invisibility that comes with being consistently reasonable. People stop checking in. They stop asking if you're okay, because you always appear to be. Even I started to believe that my lack of reaction meant there was nothing to react to. When friends talked about relationship struggles, they often looked at me as proof of what working through things was supposed to look like, as if my calmness was evidence that endurance was the same as health. I smiled, nodded, and rarely corrected them. Inside, though, I was cataloging moments, not in a dramatic way, not with the intention of using them later. More like an internal filing system that recorded how often I adjusted and how rarely the adjustment went the other direction. I noticed patterns before I labeled them. I felt discomfort before I named it. But outwardly, I remained consistent, approachable, forgiving. I was the wife who didn't air private issues, the one who didn't escalate disagreements, the one who believed that love meant absorbing impact quietly so nothing else had to break. That version of me became very useful to everyone but myself. What's strange is that no one explicitly told me to be invisible. There was no meeting where roles were assigned. It happened through reinforcement. Every time I stayed calm, things moved on faster. Every time I forgave, tension dissolved. The reward was peace. Temporary, fragile peace. But peace nonetheless. And I learned, slowly, that people grow comfortable when you make things easy for them. Comfort can harden into expectation without anyone noticing the transition. In those years, I thought I was choosing harmony. I didn't realize I was also choosing to be unread. I was present, but rarely considered. Trusted, but not deeply checked on. Appreciated, but not carefully handled. And because I didn't protest, no one assumed there was anything to fix. Not yet. At that point in the story, I didn't feel wronged. I felt responsible. Responsible for keeping things smooth. Responsible for understanding before being understood. Responsible for forgiving before being asked. I believed our marriage survived because I kept forgiving. I didn't yet understand what that forgiveness was slowly teaching everyone, including myself, about my limits. The first time it happened, it was so small I almost didn't register it as anything at all. That's the dangerous part about early moments like these. They don't arrive with alarms. They slip in quietly, dressed as misunderstandings, timing issues, and stress. Things reasonable people are supposed to overlook. We were in the kitchen, late evening, the kind of hour where the day hasn't fully released you yet. I was talking about something that mattered to me. Not a crisis, just a thought I'd been carrying. I remember pausing mid-sentence because he had picked up his phone. Not aggressively, not rudely, just casually. Like my voice was background noise that could be lowered without turning off the room. He nodded once, eyes still on the screen, and said, Yeah, I get it. That was it? No argument, no harsh words. I finished what I was saying anyway. Or maybe I didn't. I don't actually remember if I completed the thought. What I remember is the sensation, something tightening briefly, then loosening as I told myself not to overthink it. He was tired. Work had been heavy. I'd chosen a bad moment. That's what forgiveness looks like in its earliest form. Not generosity, efficiency. A quick mental calculation that keeps things moving. Later that night, I replayed it once, just to check if I was being unfair. Then I shelved it. I didn't want to be the kind of person who made something out of nothing. Weeks passed. Life continued. But the moment stayed with me. Not as a grievance, but as a reference point. A small internal marker that said, this is how quickly you can be set aside. The next time was similar. Different setting. Same feeling. I was sharing an idea about something we might do differently. Financially, practically. He interrupted me mid-sentence, corrected a detail that didn't matter, then continued as if the interruption hadn't happened. No apology, no pause. Again, no one else noticed. There was no audience. Just the two of us and the assumption that I would absorb the interruption without comment. And I did. I smiled, adjusted my phrasing, let him finish. Told myself that clarity mattered more than credit. What I didn't say, what I didn't even fully admit to myself, was that each time this happened, Something very precise was being communicated. Not loudly, but clearly. Your thoughts are optional. Your timing is negotiable. Your presence is flexible. Still, I didn't label it as disrespect. That word felt too strong, too dramatic for moments this mild. Instead, I filed them under human flaws and normal marriage things. Everyone else would have done the same. That's what I told myself. What made these moments linger wasn't the action itself, it was the pattern beginning to form. The consistency of being slightly deprioritized. The subtle way my voice became something that could be stepped over without consequence. I started to notice how quickly conversations shifted away from my contributions. How my suggestions were acknowledged but rarely returned to. How decisions seemed to solidify after I spoke, not because of what I said, but because the moment had passed. Still, I forgave. Instinctively, silently. Forgiveness, in those early days, felt like maturity. Like choosing not to nitpick. Like understanding that love requires flexibility. I believed that if I stayed generous, the balance would naturally correct itself. But generosity without boundaries doesn't teach care. It teaches comfort. And comfort, I would later learn, can be the most efficient eraser. At the time, though, I was still committed to being the calm one. The reasonable one. The woman who didn't make small cuts bleed by insisting they be examined. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself it wouldn't happen again. I told myself that even if it did, it didn't mean anything. But my body remembered, even when my mouth stayed quiet. The first small cut didn't hurt much. That's why it worked. Once something happens more than once, it starts to lose its shock. That's how normalization begins. Not with acceptance, but with familiarity. The mind adjusts before the heart has a chance to object. And because nothing explodes, you assume nothing is wrong. By then, interruptions had become background noise. Not constant, but frequent enough that I began timing my thoughts more carefully. I learned to condense what I wanted to say, to lead with conclusions instead of context, to speak faster, as if speed might protect my words from being cut off. I told myself this was communication maturity, adaptation, growth. What I didn't call it was shrinking. There were moments when I would pause before speaking at all, quickly assessing whether what I wanted to say was worth the effort. If it felt too nuanced, too emotional, too inconvenient, I held it back. Not because I was afraid of conflict, but because I'd learned the return on investment was low. When I did speak up about something that bothered me, the response was never cruel. That's what made it so easy to doubt myself. He would say things like, "You're reading too much into it," or, "I didn't mean it like that." Not dismissive on the surface, reasonable even, delivered calmly, as if the misunderstanding lived entirely on my side of the conversation. And I accepted that explanation more often than not. After all, intent mattered. That's what I believed. And his intent was rarely malicious. So I adjusted my interpretation instead of questioning the impact. Each time I did that, I reinforced a quiet rule. Discomfort was mine to manage. Friends would sometimes ask how we were doing, and I always said we were fine. Not defensively. Honestly. Because compared to the stories they told, shouting matches, betrayals, chaos, our issues felt too small to count. No one warns you that emotional erosion doesn't require cruelty. It only requires consistency. Over time, I stopped bringing up certain topics altogether. Not as a decision, but as a reflex. It was easier to stay agreeable than to risk the subtle exhaustion of being gently overridden. I became skilled at self-soothing, at telling myself stories that made everything feel acceptable. He's under pressure. This isn't personal. Every marriage has these phases. And to be fair, I wasn't wrong. At least not entirely. Life was stressful. No one is perfectly attentive all the time. But the imbalance was growing, and I was the only one compensating for it. What made this phase particularly confusing was that nothing looked wrong from the outside. We functioned. We showed up. We laughed at the right moments. I still cared deeply. I still wanted us to work. But inside, something was recalibrating. I started to feel less like a participant and more like a stabilizing force. someone whose job was to absorb fluctuations so the system could continue uninterrupted. My needs didn't disappear. They just became less urgent than the peace. And because I didn't demand space, no one noticed I was losing it. This is where forgiveness quietly changed its shape. It stopped being a conscious choice and became an automatic response. A reflex that kicked in before I could even feel the full weight of what I was excusing. Each time I forgave, it felt like I was preserving the relationship. What I didn't see yet was that I was also preserving the pattern. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as an insult. Sometimes it arrives as an assumption that you will bend, that you will understand, that you will carry the extra weight without naming it. And I did. I told myself I was strong enough, patient enough, emotionally intelligent enough to handle it. But strength without reciprocity becomes solitude. By the time I noticed how quiet I'd become, it already felt normal. Not peaceful, normal. And that's how I learned the most dangerous phase isn't when something hurts. It's when it stops surprising you. Roles don't always get assigned out loud. Sometimes they emerge from repetition, from what people learn they can rely on without asking. In our marriage, my role solidified the moment my flexibility became predictable. I was the one who remembered dates, managed transitions, smoothed emotional edges before they cut anyone else. If there was tension in the room, it instinctively became mine to dissolve. Not because anyone demanded it, but because I was good at it. And being good at something often turns into being expected to do it forever. I became reliable in a very specific way, not the kind of reliable that invites care in return, but the kind that allows others to relax. I was dependable, which meant I could be leaned on without checking whether I was tired. I could be deferred without explanation. I could be interrupted because I'd circle back quietly, if at all. What I noticed, slowly, was that my reliability made me less visible. People don't watch closely what they assume will always function. In conversations, decisions would land just after I spoke, but rarely because of what I said. My input became something to move past, not build on. If I pushed back gently, it was framed as an unnecessary complication. If I stayed quiet, it was taken as agreement. Either way, the outcome was the same. I was useful. And usefulness, I learned, is not the same as being valued. There was a particular moment that clarified this for me. Not dramatic, just precise. We were discussing a decision that would affect both of us. I raised a concern, calmly, with reasons. He listened, nodded, then said, "I've already thought this through." The conversation ended there. Not because he shut me down harshly, but because the structure of the exchange made further discussion feel redundant. My role wasn't to contribute. It was to support what had already been decided. I remember feeling something settle in my chest. Not anger, recognition. This is who I am in this dynamic, I thought. The stabilizer, the confirmer, the one whose agreement smooths the path forward. Once you see your role clearly, you start to notice how often it's reinforced. If I expressed doubt, it was met with reassurance instead of curiosity. If I expressed fatigue, it was acknowledged briefly, then bypassed. My emotions were treated as something to manage, not something to explore. And because I rarely escalated, because I didn't demand space or raise my voice, the role remained unchallenged. I told myself this was a partnership. That compromise required someone to be flexible, and I happened to be better at it. I didn't want to believe that the flexibility was one-directional. But roles don't need intention to be real. They only need consistency. By then, I was carrying an unspoken understanding. My job was to make things easier, not to be complicated. To be steady, not sensitive. To absorb, not redirect. What troubled me wasn't that I had this role. It was that I'd never agreed to it consciously. It had been shaped around me while I was busy keeping things calm. Still, I didn't confront it, not yet. Part of me believed that naming it would create tension, and tension felt like failure. I had built an identity around being the calm center, and I wasn't ready to question what would happen if I stepped out of that position. So I stayed in it. Reliable, useful, invisible. And in doing so, I made it easier for everyone, including myself, to forget that roles can be renegotiated until they can't. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no final straw thrown onto an already heavy pile. In fact, the day itself was unremarkable, quiet, almost forgettable. That's how internal changes often arrive. They don't announce themselves. They settle in. I was alone in the house, folding laundry that had already been folded once and left untouched. The light coming through the window was soft, late afternoon, the kind that makes everything look calmer than it feels. I remember thinking how peaceful it looked, and how little peace I actually felt inside it. I had been moving through the motions of my role for so long that I rarely paused to ask myself how I was doing. That afternoon I did. Not dramatically, just a brief, honest check-in. And the answer surprised me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't heartbroken. I was absent. There was a distance between who I was and who I presented that I could no longer ignore. I realized I had become very skilled at performing stability while quietly detaching from myself. That was the moment something shifted. Not outwardly, not in my behavior, but in my awareness. I began to see my silence differently. Before, it felt like patience, maturity, emotional intelligence. Now, I saw it as avoidance of discomfort. Yes, but also of truth. I had been protecting the relationship from friction at the cost of protecting myself from erosion. What made this realization land was its clarity. There was no accusation attached to it, just an understanding. This dynamic will not change on its own. I didn't suddenly decide to leave. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even change how I spoke. I just stopped telling myself comforting stories. I let things be exactly what they were. That night, we had dinner and talked about ordinary things. I listened. I responded. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. I noticed how often my responses were anticipatory rather than expressive. How I spoke to maintain flow, not to be known. How often I softened my own edges before anyone else had the chance to react. It wasn't painful in the way realizations are often portrayed. It was quiet, almost clinical, like finally seeing a long-standing condition for what it was. I didn't feel betrayed. I felt responsible, not in a self-blaming way, but in an adult way. I had participated in this. I had reinforced it. I had taught people how to treat me by what I consistently allowed. That understanding didn't make me smaller. It made me steadier. For the first time in a long while, I felt present inside my own body. Not braced, not performing, just aware. That night, lying in bed, I didn't make promises to myself. I didn't rehearse future conversations. I didn't plan exits. I simply acknowledged a truth I could no longer unsee. The version of me that kept everything smooth was not the version of me that could stay whole. From that day forward, silence was no longer automatic. It didn't disappear, but it became a choice. And that difference mattered more than I realized at the time. Because when silence is chosen consciously, it stops being surrender. It becomes positioning. I went to sleep knowing nothing had changed yet, and that everything eventually would. After that day, I didn't become louder. That's the part people often expect. That awareness leads to confrontation. That clarity demands immediate expression. For me, it didn't. What changed wasn't the volume of my voice, but the intention behind its absence. I still stayed quiet often, but now I knew why. Before, my silence was reflexive. A way to keep things easy. Now it was selective. I paid attention to when I spoke and, more importantly, when I chose not to. I stopped filling gaps that weren't mine to fill. If a conversation stalled because someone had spoken over me earlier, I let the silence sit. If a decision was being made without my input, I noted it instead of rushing to insert myself. I wasn't withdrawing out of resentment. I was observing patterns without interfering with them. That's when I noticed something important. People interpreted my continued quiet as compliance. Because nothing in my tone had changed. Nothing in their behavior did either. They mistook my restraint for agreement, my calm for contentment. and that misunderstanding gave me information I hadn't had before. I saw how often my presence was taken for granted, how rarely anyone checked in when I stopped compensating, how quickly assumptions filled the space where my effort used to be. This wasn't a test. I wasn't trying to provoke a reaction. I was learning. Silence, when chosen deliberately, becomes a mirror. It shows you what others expect you to do without being asked. I also began to notice myself more closely. I felt less anxious, less rushed. Without the constant need to manage outcomes, I had more internal bandwidth. I started writing, not in that leather notebook, but privately, on scraps of paper I threw away. Not journaling emotions, but recording facts. Dates, conversations, decisions that were presented as mutual but hadn't been. This wasn't preparation in the dramatic sense. It was grounding. I was anchoring myself in reality instead of interpretation. When moments of dismissal happened, and they still did, I didn't rush to soften them. I let them land fully. I let myself feel the weight of what was being communicated without immediately excusing it. And interestingly, the more I did that, the less personal it felt. Patterns don't need villains. They just need repetition. There were moments when he noticed something was different. Not enough to name it, but enough to comment lightly. "You've been quiet lately," he said once, not with concern, but curiosity, as if it were a phase that would pass. I smiled and said I was fine, and I was. More fine than I'd been in years, because for the first time my silence belonged to me. I wasn't storing resentment. I wasn't rehearsing arguments. I wasn't punishing anyone with distance. I was simply no longer cushioning the dynamic. And without that cushioning, I could finally see its shape clearly. This is where quiet people are often underestimated, because silence doesn't always mean inaction. Sometimes it means alignment. Sometimes it means the internal decision has already been made, even if the external world hasn't caught up yet. I didn't announce my awareness. I didn't demand change. I let things continue exactly as they were, because now I needed to see whether anyone else would notice the imbalance without me pointing to it. They didn't, and that told me everything I needed to know. Silence had stopped being a shield. It had become a lens, and through it, I could finally see what staying would continue to cost me. While everything on the surface remained the same, something else was happening quietly, steadily, and completely unnoticed. I was preparing, not in the way people imagine preparation. No secret meetings, no dramatic plans, no late-night urgency. What I was doing was far less visible and far more effective. I was paying attention with intention. I started noticing how decisions were framed. Which ones were presented as already handled? Which ones were called mutual only after the fact? I listened carefully to the language used when my agreement was assumed versus when it was actually sought. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct. I didn't challenge. I recorded, not emotionally, factually. I began to understand the structure of our life together in a way I hadn't before. Financial flows, legal arrangements, responsibilities that were technically shared but practically carried by one of us. I wasn't alarmed by what I found. I was clarified. For years, I had operated on trust and interpretation. Now, I was operating on documentation and reality. In conversations, I asked fewer questions, but better ones. Neutral ones. The kind that didn't signal resistance, only curiosity. Answers came easily when no one felt threatened. People reveal a lot when they believe they're being agreed with. I learned how much was assumed to be stable simply because I had always been stable. How many systems relied on my quiet maintenance to function smoothly, and how little redundancy existed if I ever stopped. What surprised me most wasn't the imbalance. It was how invisible my contribution had been, even to the person closest to me. Not maliciously, not consciously, just comfortably. That's the thing about being consistently competent and calm. People stop seeing the effort. They see the result and assume it's natural, permanent, guaranteed. I also began educating myself again, not in a dramatic return to school sense, but intentionally. I refreshed my understanding of financial independence. I revisited legal basics I hadn't thought about in years. I asked hypothetical questions in safe settings and listened carefully to the answers. None of this required secrecy. It required privacy. There's a difference. I wasn't hiding. I was simply no longer narrating my inner world for someone who hadn't been listening to it anyway. At the same time, I took stock of myself, who I was without the role of stabilizer, what I wanted when I wasn't managing outcomes, what values still felt non-negotiable now that I'd stopped bending automatically. This wasn't a reinvention, it was a return. And because nothing outward had changed, no one suspected anything inward had either. That's the advantage of being underestimated for so long. People don't watch closely when they believe you'll always adapt. They don't ask questions when they assume you're fine. They don't prepare for shifts they don't think you're capable of making. I wasn't becoming colder. I wasn't withdrawing affection. I still showed up, still participated, still cared. But I was no longer negotiating with myself to stay comfortable for someone else. Every day, my understanding deepened, not into anger, but into certainty. I could see exactly where this path led if nothing changed. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of that knowledge. I wasn't waiting for permission. I was positioning myself to choose. What they never noticed was that my quiet had become directional. That my calm was no longer about preservation, but about preparation. That the woman they thought was endlessly flexible had finally found her center and wasn't moving it again. There was no rush, no ticking clock, just alignment. And once alignment happens, action becomes inevitable. They just didn't know it yet. The reveal didn't come with a rush of emotion. There was no spike of adrenaline, no moment where I sat back and thought, so this is it. What I felt instead was something far quieter and far more stabilizing. Clarity. It happened during an ordinary review of documents. Papers I'd signed years ago without much thought, because trust filled in the gaps where curiosity should have been. This time, I wasn't skimming. I was reading with full attention, not because I expected to find anything alarming, but because I was no longer willing to assume everything was balanced just because it had always felt manageable. And that's when I saw it. Not a betrayal, not a secret account, not anything dramatic enough to justify outrage. What I discovered was leverage, but not in the manipulative sense people often imagine. It was structural. I realized how much of our shared life depended on my quiet participation. How many safeguards existed because I had been consistent, present, and cooperative? How many systems assumed my ongoing consent rather than actively securing it? Legally, financially, practically. For years, I had believed that staying meant stability for both of us. What I saw now was that my staying had insulated him far more than it had protected me. This wasn't a moment of triumph. It was sobering. I didn't feel powerful. I felt awake. The leverage wasn't something I could use aggressively. It was something I could withdraw cleanly. And that distinction mattered. It meant my power wasn't in confrontation, but in consent. I closed the folder and sat still for a long time. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I needed to let the understanding settle without dramatizing it. I didn't want to turn it into a story where someone won. I wanted it to remain what it was: information. Information changes the shape of choices. I thought about all the times I'd forgiven without asking for repair. All the moments I'd stayed quiet to keep things running smoothly. I could now see exactly how those choices had positioned me. Not weakly, but invisibly. And invisibility, when paired with awareness, becomes optional. I didn't confront him with what I'd learned. There was no reason to. The knowledge wasn't meant to provoke a reaction. It was meant to anchor a decision. From that day on, I knew that staying would no longer be neutral. Leaving would no longer be catastrophic. Both were possible. Both were survivable. That was the private reveal. Not that I had been wronged, but that I had options. The most surprising part was how calm that realization made me. When you know where you stand, urgency fades. Desperation disappears. You stop negotiating from fear. I moved through the days that followed with an internal steadiness I hadn't felt in years. Conversations felt different, not because I spoke more, but because I was no longer hoping they would change anything. Hope had been replaced by clarity, and clarity is quiet. I continued showing up as before. not to deceive anyone, but because nothing had outwardly changed yet. The reveal was internal, and it needed time to integrate. I paid attention to how often my agreement was assumed, how rarely were my preferences checked, how smoothly things continued as long as I stayed in my role. And I knew, with certainty, that the moment I stepped out of it, the entire structure would shift. That knowledge didn't make me cruel. It made me careful. I wasn't preparing to hurt anyone. I was preparing to stop absorbing the hurt quietly. The reveal didn't give me satisfaction. It gave me resolve. And once the resolution settles in, the next step is no longer if, it's when. Once you see your options clearly, indecision becomes a form of self-betrayal. That's what the decision point really is. Not a dramatic crossroads, but a quiet recognition that continuing without choosing is still a choice. And usually, it's the one that costs you the most. I gave myself time, not to hesitate, but to ensure that whatever I chose would be clean. I wasn't interested in half measures or emotional reversals. I needed the decision to come from alignment, not reaction. There were several paths available to me, and I considered each one carefully. I could stay and begin asking for more, set boundaries, name patterns, renegotiate the dynamic. On paper, this was the most straightforward option. It appealed to the part of me that valued repair, that believed relationships could recalibrate if given enough honesty. But when I imagined that path honestly, I saw something else too. Exhaustion. The emotional labor of teaching someone to notice what they'd been comfortable not seeing. The likelihood was that my needs would be addressed briefly, then slowly deprioritized again once the tension eased. I knew myself well enough to know that I would be the one carrying the process. Another option was to stay and accept things as they were, to continue forgiving, to lower my expectations further. This path required no confrontation, no upheaval. It would look like stability to everyone else. But when I imagined my future inside that version of myself, I felt something close to grief. Not because it was unbearable, but because it was finite. I could see exactly how small I would become inside it. The third option was the one I had avoided naming for a long time: leaving. Not in anger, not as a punishment, not as an ultimatum, as an ending. This option scared me. Not because of chaos, but because of finality. Because leaving meant accepting that love and compatibility are not the same thing. That forgiveness does not obligate permanence. That staying kind does not require staying. I didn't rush this choice. I sat with it until it stopped feeling charged, until the fear softened into practicality, until the sadness no longer argued with the truth. What made the decision irreversible wasn't a single event. It was a realization I couldn't undo. If I stayed now, knowing what I knew, I would be consenting to my own erosion. That knowledge changed everything. I didn't want to confront and hope. I didn't want to threaten and wait. I didn't want to educate someone into seeing me when they'd grown comfortable not looking. I wanted to choose myself without making anyone else wrong. So I chose the path that required the least distortion of my values. I chose to leave cleanly, quietly, with dignity. The moment that decision settled, something unexpected happened. The tension I'd been carrying for years was released. Not all at once, but enough to feel the difference. My thoughts became clearer. I sleep more deeply. The constant background negotiation in my mind went silent. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved. There was no need to announce the decision yet. No urgency to act immediately. The choice had been made internally, and that was enough to begin moving. From that point on, every action I took had direction. Every step was no longer exploratory. It was preparatory. The ending had already occurred inside me. Everything that followed was simply execution. And that's the thing about real endings. By the time they're visible to others, they've already been lived privately. Once the decision was made, urgency disappeared. That might sound counterintuitive, but certainty has that effect. When you know where you're going, there's no need to rush. You move deliberately, quietly, without announcing each step. That's what I did. I didn't change my behavior in ways that would raise questions. I didn't withdraw emotionally or become distant. From the outside, our lives looked exactly the same. Routine has a way of protecting transitions when you let it. Internally, though, I was no longer negotiating. I was executing. I started by organizing what already existed. Documents I'd once trusted blindly were now categorized, understood, and contextualized. I wasn't searching for an advantage. I was ensuring accuracy. Knowing where things stood mattered more than controlling outcomes. I opened accounts in my own name. Nothing dramatic, just enough to reestablish autonomy where it had slowly dissolved. I updated the records, clarified responsibilities, ensured that what was mine, legally, financially, practically, was clearly defined. These weren't acts of aggression. They were acts of completion. I consulted professionals quietly, asking hypothetical questions instead of announcing intent. I listened more than I spoke. I took notes I never needed to reference again because the understanding itself was what mattered. What struck me most during this phase was how invisible preparation is when it doesn't disrupt comfort. No one noticed because nothing felt different. I still showed up to dinners, still participated in conversations, still handled logistics with the same competence as always. That consistency became my cover, not intentionally, but effectively. This is where people misunderstand quiet endings. They assume silence means hesitation. In reality, it often means the decision has already passed the point of debate. I wasn't waiting to be convinced otherwise. I was making sure the ending would be clean. There was no bitterness fueling my actions, no secret satisfaction. If anything, I felt almost neutral, focused, grounded. The absence of emotional chaos made each step easier to take. I also began simplifying my life, not dramatically, just intentionally. I let go of things I didn't want to carry forward. I clarified what mattered and what didn't. I noticed how much of my energy had been tied up in maintaining balance rather than building direction. As I moved quietly, I paid attention to how little resistance there was. That's when it became clear how much of the structure depended on my continued participation. As long as I stayed functional, no one questioned stability. The assumption was permanence. And assumptions are fragile. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. This phase wasn't about secrecy. It was about discretion. There's a difference. Secrecy hides intent. Discretion protects timing. I wasn't deceiving anyone. I was simply no longer narrating my internal process for someone who hadn't been part of it in a long time. Each step reinforced the same truth. I was capable of ending this without implosion, without spectacle, without rewriting history. By the time everything was in place, nothing outward had changed, but the path forward was clear, unobstructed, and ready. The most telling part was how calm I felt walking through it all. Not numb, not detached, just steady. Because when you move from self-respect instead of reaction, silence stops being a void. It becomes momentum. Consequences don't always arrive with confrontation. Sometimes they arrive as an absence, as delays, as small disruptions that don't seem connected to any single cause, but slowly reveal that something foundational has shifted. The first signs were subtle. Things that had always run smoothly began requiring attention. Tasks I used to anticipate were suddenly unhandled. Decisions that had once been absorbed quietly now hovered, unresolved. At first, it was framed as an inconvenience. Didn't you already take care of this? I thought you usually handled that. There was no accusation in his tone, just mild confusion. The kind that assumes the system will correct itself once someone nudges it. I responded calmly. Sometimes I explained. Sometimes I didn't. I no longer rushed to fill gaps that hadn't been acknowledged as shared responsibility. That's when the discomfort began. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a growing sense of friction where there hadn't been any before. He became more aware of things that used to happen without effort. Not because I announced my withdrawal, but because the effort was no longer invisible. Still, there was no recognition of why. That's the strange part about consequences. They're often felt before they're understood. Conversations took on a different tone. Questions were asked where assumptions had lived before. Not about feelings, about logistics, timing, outcomes. I remained calm, consistent, cooperative, but I was no longer compensating. And without compensation, the imbalance becomes obvious. I noticed moments of irritation surface, not directed at me exactly, but at the situation. A sense of disruption, of inconvenience, of something no longer working as smoothly as it used to. There was still no self-reflection, no connecting of dots, just an expectation that things would eventually return to baseline. They didn't. What I found most telling was how quickly the language shifted from certainty to uncertainty. I'm not sure why this is so complicated lately. Things feel different. Different, but not questioned. People often feel loss before they understand its source. They experience discomfort without context and assume it's temporary. A phase, something external. I watched this happen with a kind of detached clarity, not because I was indifferent, but because I had already done the emotional work. I wasn't waiting for acknowledgement. I wasn't hoping for a repair. I was observing the natural outcome of a system that had relied too heavily on one person's quiet labor. The consequences weren't punitive. They were instructive. They revealed how much had been taken for granted. And still, nothing was said directly. There were moments when he seemed close to noticing, pauses in conversation, glances that lingered a second longer than usual. But awareness requires discomfort, and discomfort was still being avoided. I didn't force it. I didn't explain. Because consequences that are explained too early often get negotiated away. This wasn't about teaching a lesson. It was about letting reality speak without my interpretation layered over it. As the days passed, the subtle losses accumulated. Not in catastrophic ways, but in enough small disruptions to create unease. The structure was still standing, but the ease was gone. And ease, I had learned, was the currency that had kept everything functioning. Without it, questions begin to form. They just hadn't been asked yet. By the time concern turned into urgency, the window for repair had already closed. Not because I was unwilling to talk, but because the dynamic had finally reached a point where recognition came too late to change its outcome. Awareness, when delayed long enough, loses its power to heal. The shift in him was subtle at first. Questions started appearing where assumptions had once lived. Not about me, exactly, but about us. About timing. About why things felt heavier, more complicated, and less smooth than before. "Have I done something?" he asked one evening, almost casually. The question landed softly, but it carried weight. I looked at him and realized something important. This wasn't curiosity. It was panic, just beginning to surface. Not dramatic panic. The quiet kind that comes when comfort is threatened. I answered honestly, but briefly. I didn't unload years of context. I didn't recite examples. I said something simple, something true. Things have been this way for a long time. He nodded, as if that settled it. As if acknowledging duration was the same as understanding impact. In the days that followed, there were attempts, small ones. More attentive listening. A few extra check-ins. Gestures that, at another point in time, might have felt meaningful. But timing matters. When repair only begins after loss becomes inconvenient, it rarely reaches the root. I could see him trying to recalibrate, but the effort felt reactive rather than reflective. Focused on restoring ease, not on understanding how the ease had been maintained at my expense. And I knew, with a calm certainty, that this wasn't enough anymore. Not because I was unforgiving, but because I was finished forgiving in advance. This was the moment many people imagine as the turning point. The place where reconciliation either happens or fails. But for me, the turning point had already passed quietly, months earlier. What was happening now was recognition without transformation. He wanted reassurance, stability, confirmation that things could go back to how they were. I no longer wanted that version of fine. When conversations drifted toward fixing things, I felt no pull to argue, no urge to explain myself better, no desire to be understood more clearly. That absence of urgency was the answer. I wasn't angry, I wasn't cold, I was complete. That's the part people don't talk about enough. Sometimes the relationship doesn't end because of conflict. It ends because the internal work is done. He sensed the distance then. Not because I withdrew affection, but because I stopped negotiating my reality. The attempts intensified briefly. More presence. More questions. A subtle fear was creeping into his tone. But fear doesn't rebuild trust. And attention that arrives only when loss is imminent doesn't feel like care. It feels like maintenance. I didn't criticize his efforts. I acknowledged them. And then I let them go, because I knew something he didn't yet. Even if everything improved now, it wouldn't change what it had cost me to get here. The ending wasn't caused by one failure. It was caused by too many moments that required forgiveness without repair. By the time it felt urgent to fix things, I no longer wanted them fixed. I wanted them finished. The conversation happened on an ordinary morning. No dramatic buildup. No tense silence beforehand. We sat across from each other with coffee between us, the kind of setting where difficult things are usually softened by routine. That felt appropriate. I didn't want intensity. I wanted accuracy. He began by saying he felt distance. Those things felt fragile lately. That he didn't understand when exactly we'd drifted this far apart. I listened without interrupting, not out of restraint, but because there was nothing in me that needed to rush anymore. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't recount history. I didn't present evidence. I didn't raise my voice or lower it deliberately. I spoke the way you do when you're no longer trying to convince someone of anything. I've been forgiving for a long time, I said. And that kept things going. But it also kept things from changing. He looked at me, confused but attentive. I explained, not emotionally but clearly, that our marriage hadn't ended because of a single moment. It ended because the pattern required me to keep shrinking in order to stay comfortable for both of us. I didn't accuse him of cruelty. I didn't label him careless. I told him the truth as I experienced it, that my silence had been mistaken for consent, and my patience for permanence. He asked why I hadn't said more sooner. I answered honestly, because every time I forgave, it felt easier than explaining. And over time, explaining stopped feeling useful. There was no shouting, no denial, just a long pause where the weight of what I was saying had room to land. He asked if there was anything he could do now. That question mattered, but not in the way people think. I took a breath and said the hardest thing calmly. If I were asking you to change, that would mean I still believed this could be fixed. I don't. The room stayed quiet, not heavy, just still. I told him that I didn't hate him, that I wasn't leaving to punish him, that I wasn't even angry anymore. I was leaving because staying would require me to betray the version of myself I'd finally reclaimed. He tried to argue gently, to offer adjustments, to promise more awareness. I listened, and then I said, I believe you mean that. I just don't want to live in a relationship where my needs only become visible at the edge of loss. That was when he understood. Maybe not fully, but enough. There was grief in his expression, but also recognition. Not of guilt, exactly, but of consequence. We talked logistics after that, calmly, respectfully, without hostility. The conversation lasted longer than it needed to, but not longer than it should have. When it ended, there was no dramatic exit, no slammed doors, just two people sitting in the reality of an ending that had already happened internally for one of them. What struck me most was how calm I felt walking away from that table. Not relieved, not triumphant, just aligned. Because confrontation doesn't have to be loud to be final. Sometimes the most powerful endings happen when there's nothing left to prove, and nothing left to forgive. After the ending, people expected me to be different in obvious ways. They expected grief that spilled outward, anger that needed to be explained, a dramatic reinvention. When none of that appeared, some assumed I was suppressing something. Others assumed I'd moved on too quickly. The truth was quieter than all of that. I didn't feel empty. I felt refreshed. For a long time, my identity had been shaped around steadiness, around being the one who held things together. When that role fell away, I didn't lose myself. I uncovered parts of me that had been waiting without complaint. I learned how much energy I'd been spending on anticipation, on emotional management, on staying slightly ahead of disappointment. Without that constant vigilance, my days felt simpler. Not easier, but cleaner. I began making decisions without rehearsing how they would be received. That alone changed everything. I noticed how my body responded differently to silence now. It wasn't tense. It wasn't defensive. Silence became spacious instead of strategic. A place to think, not to brace. I didn't stop being kind. I didn't stop being thoughtful. Those things were never the problem. What changed was my relationship to obligation. I no longer equated love with endurance, or patience with virtue, or forgiveness with moral superiority. I learned that forgiveness, when it replaces boundaries instead of working alongside them, becomes a slow form of self-abandonment. I didn't carry bitterness forward. There was nothing to carry. The clarity that ended the marriage also dissolved the resentment. That surprised me. People assume that leaving means anger was finally unleashed. For me, leaving meant anger was no longer necessary. I could see the past without rewriting it, see both the care that existed and the harm that accumulated. See how two people can do their best and still create a dynamic that diminishes one of them. I don't tell this story because I think I handled everything perfectly. I didn't. I stayed longer than I should have. I forgave when I should have asked for a repair. But I also didn't betray myself at the end. That matters. Now, when I enter relationships, romantic or otherwise, I pay attention to balance early, not obsessively, just honestly. I notice who adjusts and who expects, who listens when it's inconvenient, who repairs without being prompted. I don't wait to become invisible anymore, and I don't confuse calm with consent. The quiet dominance people talk about isn't coldness. It isn't control. It's alignment. It's knowing where you end and refusing to blur that line for the sake of comfort. I'm still soft, still reflective, still forgiving. But forgiveness is no longer my first response. It's something I offer when there's accountability on the other side of it. Who I am now isn't louder than who I was before. She's just no longer shrinking. There's a phrase people like to repeat when talking about relationships. Love means never giving up. For a long time, I believed that. I believed endurance was proof. That staying was a moral act. That forgiveness, repeated often enough, could transform anything. What I understand now is quieter and harder. Love doesn't fail because someone gives up. Sometimes it fails because one person carries it alone for too long. Our marriage survived because I kept forgiving. That part is true. Forgiveness smoothed the edges. It delayed the conflict. It postponed endings. It kept things functioning long after they should have been examined. But forgiveness also delayed the ending. It didn't prevent it. And delaying an ending isn't always an act of love. Sometimes it's an act of fear. Sometimes it's hope without evidence. Sometimes it's kindness turned inward so sharply that it disappears. I don't regret forgiving. Forgiveness taught me empathy, restraint, and emotional depth. It helped me stay human in moments where bitterness would have been easier. What I regret is confusing forgiveness with responsibility. I was not responsible for making something unbalanced feel sustainable. I was not responsible for translating my silence into someone else's growth. And I was not obligated to remain in a dynamic that required me to keep becoming smaller in order to stay. There is a difference between being patient and being erased. Between understanding and disappearing. Between love and self-sacrifice that no one asked for, but everyone benefited from. This story isn't about blame, it's about clarity. It's about recognizing that quiet people often leave long before they physically go. That endings are rarely impulsive, they're cumulative. And that when someone finally chooses themselves calmly, it can look sudden only to those who weren't paying attention. If you take anything from this, let it be this. Forgiveness is not a substitute for repair. Silence is not consent. And staying kind does not require staying forever. You're allowed to outgrow dynamics that once felt survivable. You're allowed to end chapters without turning them into battles. And you're allowed to walk away without proving how much you endured first. Sometimes the most honest ending is the quiet one. The one where no one is punished, but truth is finally honored. Before I end this, I want to leave you with one question. Not to answer here, but to sit with honestly. Have you ever forgiven something so many times that it became the reason nothing ever changed? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, especially if you've lived through a quiet ending of your own. Thank you for listening.